at Birmingham City University. Hanna is going to talk about the role of housing in housing wealth accumulation and other financialization. And many thanks to Özlem Onaran, who is going to provide some comments. Özlem is a professor of economics at the University of Greenwich. So, Hanna, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, and thank you, Yanis, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much for the invitation to present this really wonderful seminar series. So I'm just going to share my screen. I do hope you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So the title, I amended it slightly to reflect a bit more what the kind of main contribution of the analysis is about. However, it is very close to the role of housing and how we look at housing and the household sector more specifically in the SFC modeling framework. So it is a little bit different to perhaps the way that the SFC models are typically used, but I do hope that you will see, it is a different way of looking at the modeling framework to show how versatile this tool is for different purposes. So the paper is forthcoming soon, I hope, in JPKE under a slightly different title. But the gist of the presentation focuses on the links between financialization and inequality and how we can think about modeling the household sector in SFC models and what it brings to the table when it comes to trying to understand different ways, different measures of inequality in SFC models. Is it working? There you go. So just right off the bat, of course, financialization is a topic that is very vast, and I would like to clarify from the beginning that the aspect of financialization this particular analysis is focusing on refers to the what I call financial sector transformation, specifically in the context of an economy like the US, so a highly financialized economy since roughly 1980s. And I will talk about some key kind of processes that make this case quite unique on the one hand, but also interesting to study. And of course, the first very important element is that indeed, in the US, the processes of debt securitization and financial innovation, together with these processes being facilitated by policy itself, is quite unique in the global economy. But what is to me even more interesting is how tightly these processes have been linked with the existent and persistent systemic and structural inequalities and discrimination that, of course, cannot get into all the details right now, but nevertheless, the important thing to note in this case is that we cannot understand financialization of households specifically, but also I'd say of the financial sector in general in the US context without understanding the kind of the racial and gender dimension of the financial sector development or the transformation of the financial sector in terms of the rise of securitized instruments and what type of wealth implications it had for different parts of the population of society. And the main worrying trend here is that we do observe an increase in wealth ownership among households that typically had no wealth or had very low wealth holdings. And so this is important because it prompts us to think a bit differently about how we understand the household sector in stock flow models, but more broadly in post-Keynesian economics. And of course, the crucial observation that has been made based on empirical data is that even though we do observe increased wealth ownership across the income distribution, there are very persistent and large differences in the returns to having that wealth, and therefore how lasting or beneficial wealth ownership actually is and what impact it has on macroeconomic stability. And so the literature on inequality tends to focus, of course, on very prominently in the mainstream on individual level factors, what post-Keynesian analyses, but also other heterodox analyses, plus some at the border, let's say like Piketty bring, is the emphasis on the role of the systemic factors such as financialization on the determination of inequality in our modern societies. And of course, from the post-Keynesian literature specifically, there is very rich scholarship from people sitting in this very seminar, including those, on how the processes of financialization have been key in driving income inequality and also macroeconomic instability and stagnation in advanced capitalist economies since the 1980s and beyond. And some of the main channels that are highlighted as part of this literature refer to the corporate governance and the operation of firms, and more specifically a preference towards financial short-term profits. But also another body of the literature emphasizes the role that policy itself has played in facilitating financialization and its impact on inequality. The way that typically post-Keynesian literature analyzes the relationship between inequality and financialization is by analyzing the labor share across different economies. And indeed, it is observed that the labor share has been declining over the past decades in result of these changes related to financialization. But what I focus on in this paper is something slightly different and in line with that emphasis on household wealth itself. And so I'm going to be focusing on a slightly different aspect of distribution in this paper that pertains more to the patterns of wealth accumulation and indebtedness and how it influences personal income inequality. So I'm not going to be focusing specifically on the trends in the labor share or in functional income distribution. And here are just a few figures to support that interest in household wealth rather than income itself. The first, in the top left-hand side graph, you can see that that massive expansion of home ownership in the US at the bottom quintile of the income distribution. And even though that increase in home ownership or wealth ownership was very substantial in the 1990s and early 2000s, we do observe quite persistent inequalities in that home ownership after the Great Recession. So the data for 2016 show us that even though that increase in wealth has occurred, it has not actually materialized in any lasting gains in wealth ownership for these poorer households. And that can be partly linked to what we observe in the bottom left-hand side graph, and that is leverage. And here I'm looking at one specific aspect of leverage, the debt to asset ratio. So again, we see that it is not just wealth ownership, is net wealth ownership. So the relations of assets to debt. And then lastly, the last key motivation for my interest in wealth rather than income can be seen on the right-hand side graph, which looks at the shares of income and wealth in the US. And of course, this is very well known to many of you, but just to compare the sheer disparity between the top 1% and bottom 50% share of wealth compared to income, it's something that to me warrants the interest in looking at that personal distribution in the stock flow modeling framework, in addition to other analyses that already exist that look at the functional distribution of income. And so, to summarize the main channels of inequality that I will be looking at. So I will be looking at specifically the processes of securitization let me see. There you go. So here on the right-hand side, I'm going to be looking at how securitization has led to or has been associated with greater complexity of household balance sheets, typically understood not just by leverage, which is of course crucial, but also by the type of assets that different household groups own, and what are the the implications of that for their financial position and for stability of their finances and stability of the economy as a whole. And so I'm going to be trying to capture these distributive effects through household wealth, and the role of housing here will be very unique and very special to understand that wealth heterogeneity and apply to the stock flow consistent modeling framework. The reason for using the stock flow consistent modeling framework is pretty much because of its versatility in terms of being able to model these different sectors of the economy together in a way that is that allows us to understand how, let's say, the financial sector operations link to the household sector, and how that then translates into inequality across different household groups. And of course, there is already quite rich literature that incorporates elements of household wealth in stock flow consistent modeling. And of course, this is inspired by the experience of the subprime crisis and then the Great Recession. One thing that I wanted to point out is that while there is a lot of work done that is it is very important, that kind of at the core the dichotomous division between households understood as workers who rely on their wage income and rentiers who rely on different types of capital income and diverse wealth persists. So what has not yet been done as extensively is to try to kind of abstract, in a sense, from this kind of division between wage earners and non-wage earners, and try to focus more squarely on the heterogeneity of asset holdings. And another thing that I just wanted to point out here that relates to, for example, borrowing, very often in these models of financialization and inequality, when household borrowing enters into the model, it is typically on the side of the workers. I think only from what I am aware, the study by Passarella, Vernese, and Sawyer includes borrowing by rentiers as well. I may be wrong, but this is, to my knowledge, kind of the majority of studies do look at borrowing of workers, which of course is very important. But actually, what we observed based on empirical data from the US is that there's actually rentier, what we would understand as rentier households, so that the top 1%, the top 10% households who have the highest levels of debt ownership and the highest volumes of debt on their balance sheets, which of course is backed by equally high or higher asset holdings, which overall makes the leverage low. But nevertheless, it is a fairly important element of kind of stylized facts about the household finances across the distribution that is also not always modeled in the current literature. And the second kind of contribution that I would like to bring in is to build on the work done by De Fermos and Papatheodorou in a 2015 paper, which again, to my understanding, is one of the few papers that looks at personal inequality measures in SFC models rather than functional. So functional being inequality between capital and labor, personal being inequality within the household sector itself rather than between the sources of income. And so kind of to sum up that contribution, the aim of this analysis is to kind of again move away from the ways kind of through seeing the household sector as determined primarily by the type of income received, which is of course useful for certain tasks, but I will argue that for the purposes of understanding personal inequality, which is not yet as extensively studied, in the stock flow consistent literature. It is useful to look at households being defined by the heterogeneity of their wealth rather than their income itself. And another very important observation that prompts me to this conclusion is that there is again a well-documented increase in wage inequality associated with the period of financialization. So it is not only that what we understand as worker households become capital owners through home ownership and also ownership of other type of wealth like pension wealth, but it is also that the rentier households to some extent start accumulating wage income themselves, even though of course how they accumulate, how they earn wage income is different or distinct from how what we understood the group of worker households to earn their wage income. But nevertheless, there is this complexity that has been introduced by the processes of financialization. And so when it comes to stock flow consistent modeling literature, it is something that is not fully explored in terms of allowing what we understood to be the capitalist or the rentier households to actually become wage earners, and at the same time for the worker households to become capital owners to some extent as well. And so what the model developed in this paper does, and I put it in a slightly more user-friendly layout for the household sector, but the details of the model are in the appendix, the technical details. So I'm happy to go through some of these in the discussion section. But overall, what we have here, looking at the groups of households. So I'm now trying to go away from the distinction between workers and capitalists, or worker 1 and 2 and capitalist, which is also often done in the existing literature, where we have worker 1s that don't accumulate wealth and say workers 2 that say are homeowners, for example. But here again, the emphasis is not on the income source only, but on the heterogeneity or the diversity of the asset portfolio and what income flows are associated with it.
Hanna, you have about 4 minutes. Is that
all
okay?
Right. So yeah, let me speed up then. So the point is that the higher you go up in the income distribution, the more complex the asset holdings are. And when it gets to that, it also is linked with more income streams that are generated through these different sources of wealth. And so what is crucial here is to distinguish between those households that do not own any housing but are liable themselves for rent payments, which of course constitutes a transfer of income from those working poor households to the rentier or the working rich households, while those who do own housing among the group of leveraged homeowners or the middle class, let's say, they are they're very highly leveraged, and they do face quite different borrowing constraints, borrowing conditions than those at the very top of the distribution. What then this the aim of this analysis is to look at how this type of classification of households, where all households earn wages, all households own some wealth but different types of wealth, and all households are liable for rent payments but to a different extent, how then this is related to securitization, which is introduced by having a more complex financial sector and the issuance of mortgage-backed securities and securitization of mortgages to the middle class, let's say the leveraged homeowners group, and how then this generates channels of distribution. So I'm going to skip these matrices, which again I'm happy to discuss in the discussion. So overall, the way I use the stock flow model is again slightly different. So I'm basically simulating the full baseline scenario as outlined before, with, again, the technical details being in the paper, and I can discuss them later to go through the nuance. And then I compare it to specifications of that model where I take away some of these complexities one at a time. And I think the most interesting one probably would be the one when we look at the pure capitalist scenario where we compare it with a situation when the rentiers actually earn no wages. So this is the typical understanding of the rentier class in stock flow models. Another interesting one is where we do not distinguish between those group of leveraged homeowners, and so we do retain rentiers that earn wages, but then now homeownership is only the domain of the rentiers as an investment opportunity, not necessarily as a way of of building up their balance sheets, as it is the case for the missing group, i.e. the middle class. And again, I put this table here, but the results are discussed in the next two slides, which is what I'm going to try to kind of wrap up with. So what this analysis does is that firstly, we do find some more empirically accurate patterns of personal inequality in the full model compared to the reduced scenarios. When I say empirically accurate, I am referring to the US Survey of Consumer Finance's data. And first kind of empirical regularity that is reproduced by this model is that we obtain Gini coefficients for wealth greater than Gini coefficients for income, which is the empirically observed scenario. And even the magnitudes of the Gini indices are consistent with the recent estimates on the US Survey of Consumer Finances, particularly in the kind of the subprime period for wealth and also to some extent income, which is what the model is trying to reproduce. So overall, this setup, the full model setup, is kind of able to produce more empirically accurate patterns and values of personal inequality indices, namely the Gini index for income and wealth, than those other reduced form scenarios. Similar is the case for some of the values of leverage, but I am not going to talk about that at length right now for the sake of time. I think the more interesting result to me is the fact on the observations on personal inequality indices. And then lastly, when we come to kind of look at more specifically what's happening with the sizes of the Gini indices with the full model, where we had that more complex household structure versus model in different scenarios. Well, when we exclude wage earnings from the capitalist or the rentier class, actually inequality becomes lower in terms of the Gini index for income and wealth, as well as some of the leverage measures, which suggest that while without taking into account that more complex household structure that includes rentier wage earnings, some of the channels of inequality get obscured, and also some of the channels of macroeconomic instability get obscured. As I said, these are, I think, the more interesting one would be to talk about the scenario versus full model versus no middle class, which I think is the next kind of major interesting finding, is that when we exclude the middle class in this model, i.e. when we exclude home ownership by the group kind of that is more leveraged than the rentier group, but nevertheless owns some wealth compared to the group of the working class or the working poor, who are assumed to not be homeowners, we do find that the Gini index for income is lower, while the Gini index for wealth becomes higher. And at the same time, the debt to income ratio for the economy is lower as well. And so what this kind of prompts me to conclude is that this type of kind of model specification indicates that home ownership among the middle class or the middle group of the population that is, has wealth, has own home, has housing, but it is nevertheless the only major asset on their balance sheet. So it is unlike the rentier group. It does have an equalizing effect on wealth distribution, but primarily, but not so on income distribution. And at the same time, in the context of securitization specifically, homeownership by the middle class actually contributes to greater macroeconomic instability. And so it is again vital to try to understand how we can now take this analysis further to use it to understand some of the channels of macroeconomic instability as well. And so to conclude, to say in some final words about the usefulness of this model. Again, it is not, I'm not claiming it's the way to model the household sector in stock flow models. I'm saying it's a way of modeling the household sector if we are interested in looking at personal income and wealth inequality, and more specifically. And it also highlights that it is important to look at these different features of household balance sheets, like wages, like debt, like home ownership, more holistically. So looking at the motives for accumulation, the ways in which these different assets and income accrue on the balance sheets of different households. And of course, I do want to take this research further. There are some ideas I put down here, but I do look forward to the discussion, the comments, and hopefully some inspiration for future research as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for your presentation. And let's ask Özlem to give some comments, and then we will get some questions and comments from the floor. Özlem, over to you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to comment. Hanna, thank you for a very well written paper, and congratulations for the acceptance at JPKE. I have seen some earlier incarnations of this paper, so I'm very happy that it found its home. And I really enjoyed your presentation. After reading the paper, I think your presentation made things a lot clearer for the external observer. So that was very helpful. When I read the paper, I think I had the feeling that it is making an important contribution, and every now and then you're making it clear that you're focusing on the independent effect of wealth inequality on itself, focusing on asset structure of different types of households, in which where you're putting the spotlight on home ownership. And this gives you the three different typologies of households that you are focusing on. If I had the paper framed like this, I think I would be throughout a lot more comfortable reading it. But here comes now the but. You, however, start the paper as an analysis of multiple class structures and how that affects wealth inequality. That, of course, creates a different type of expectations on the reader. And the reader, meaning in this case I, get all the time distracted by your definitions of these household typologies. I mean, it's already accepted and forthcoming, so maybe this comment is not necessarily now very helpful, but I would really reframe it, and I would avoid defining those three household typologies, meaning renting, working poor, home owning, but leveraged middle, and what you call working rich, owning multiple houses as an investment asset. I wouldn't call these classes, because when you do that, people like me start asking, people like me who comes from a Marxist as well as Keynesian reading of economics, get stuck there. First of all, you call the working poor the working class throughout the paper. Well, working poor is part of the working class, but the way you defined your middle class, they are part of the working class too. It's all very welcome to focus on intra-working class inequality and how that translates into fragility of the households, wealth inequality, but also macroeconomic instability. These are very interesting, but the reader might get stuck once you start putting the claim as a class analysis. Well, working poor is just part of the working class. And when you start talking about class analysis, obviously your contribution in analyzing the asset structure, the type of wealth, as well as the inequality of wealth, is very valuable. But again, people like myself start asking the question, what about the ownership of means of production? And if you want to focus on different types of working classes, then what about their position in the labor process? What about the effect of institutions such as collective bargaining and unionization on those different types of workers with different education, different networks, different racial, ethnicity, citizenship, or gender backgrounds? How are they being affected by these inequalities? Because all these income inequalities then later translate into wealth inequality too. Again, the other thing in what you call the class analysis is your third category being the working rich, who are the managers, but then where are the capitalists? I wouldn't object to, from your point of view, pooling the capitalists and working rich managers, but these are again two different class positions. You can always pool them because you're focusing on not all these presumably 5 different classes, or as Eric Olin wrote it, 7 different class positions. You want to focus on 3, that's welcome. But I think it would be helpful not to call that then just working rich, because actually they're the guys also owning the shares. You could say, well, these are the managers owning the shares, but then where are the capitalists? Is there a black hole in the model? Kind of questions occur to the reader. And actually later it becomes clear to the reader that your working rich is owning financial assets and business assets. And they earn, therefore, business profits and financial profits. Okay, this was the class analysis part, and I mentioned the black hole in the model kind of concern that arises with that, because your working rich is paying interest payments, but actually, are they the ones then receiving it, or is there a 4th class, then it's in a black hole, not in the model, is arising from that ambiguity. Some other points now that might be a matter of, well, another research paper. You focused on the top 10% when you defined your third category. In our research, we noticed that there is an important difference between the wealth inequality between the top 1% versus the 99%. They have very different consumption behavior, and they have very different effect on private capital accumulation. Again, this is something you may wish to explore later. The research I'm referring to is the work we did for Rebuilding Macroeconomics, myself, Cem, and Eurydice. I think you know the working paper version of that. Okay, then back to my point about the importance of institutions explaining wealth inequality. And actually, this is also something we find in another research with Ben Tippett and Raphael Wildauer. What you find is something we can confirm as well, meaning wealth inequality is very pet dependent and depends on itself. However, things like union density, things that actually explain class inequality and also top income shares are very important for wealth inequality as well. And then this brings me to my question about the way you build in your model the share of what you call the working poor in the total wage bill. You're taking that constant, and later you're also saying that you're opting for a simple wage bargaining model. But maybe for another paper, it would be very interesting to look at how this share of the working poor in the wage bill depends on institutions, well, such as the union, trade union related institutions or collective bargaining institutions, in my opinion, or government spending and in particular social government spending related fiscal policy decisions of the government or public assets. You are talking about privatization later as a potential extension. So in my opinion, all these affect both functional income distribution within working class inequality, as well as wealth inequality between the top 1 versus 99%, which is, in my opinion, a very adequate way of looking at class inequality in terms of wealth distribution. And obviously, there are other factors like technological change that could be affecting that distribution between the working, what you call working poor, versus what you call the middle class, which I would call the skilled working class, or something more like that rather than an ambiguous middle terminology. Yeah, and therefore the model would benefit from a more elaborate labor market, labor process, wage bargaining in a a future incarnation.
Özlem, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, you scared me.
sorry about that.
I'm about to finish, Yanis.
Great.
Just
Great,
two more things I want to mention. Your consumption function, you have consumption out of imputed rent for what you call the middle class. I don't know what we gain from that in a macro model. In my opinion, we don't eat imputed rent, and the distributional effects on aggregate demand differs if you take out such imputed rent type of income in national accounts. So that's something to consider. And your investment function, I think, could be developed further, including the effects of financial assets, in particular wealth inequality, particularly if you're talking about wealth inequality. So your investment behavior is quite simplified, simply because you're doing away with the capitalist class in a way. And well, you promised us focusing on intersectionality of gender and race in the introduction. I was actually hoping to get it, but it turned out that this is something you want to do in future. I think this is actually a very interesting area for extension. And so is the point you mentioned about including government, taxation, and inheritance, again, in future extensions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Özlem, for the great comments. So we can